But thank you so much for coming. I know you're a busy man, and I really appreciate your time. Exciting and very interesting topic. You refer to your work as the 5 M's to becoming great. I'm pretty curious about what those five are and how we can implement them to become great. Let's start, though, with how did you uncover these 5 M's? Where did you find them?
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for that question.
Sure.
In the first year of my PhD program, I was handed Carol Dweck's new book at the time called Mindset. And I was fascinated by this concept, and I ended up doing my dissertation on it. And Dr. Dweck talks about how our beliefs about our capabilities and whether or not we can change them or to what extent have these really powerful effects on us. But there was something that troubled me. Dr. Dweck researches how someone's beliefs about their ability to change their talent or intelligence has a profound impact. She's a psychologist, so she focuses on the psychology, on the beliefs. But Dr. Dweck does not really address to what extent your talent or your intelligence can change. She shows that beliefs matter, but what's the reality? Can you actually improve your talent? Can you actually increase your intelligence? And so that sent me on a quest to learn everything I could about intelligence. And as I started to realize that maybe intelligence isn't something that you're just born with, maybe it's something that is developed. And of course, I think it's tempting to argue that talent or intelligence are a mixture of nature and nurture. And if you say that, it's kind of hard to be criticized. I mean, it protects you from a lot of criticism to say, well, it's got to be both. But the research that I was doing was saying that it was not both nature and nurture. The evidence I was seeing around talent and intelligence was that it wasn't coming from genes, it wasn't coming from DNA, that it was coming from experience starting from really the moment that you're conceived. And so I started to dive into all the readings that I could and to see what others who've studied talent, what they've really had to say about it, what they've discovered. And as I started to kind of put this puzzle together, I realized that it really came down to these 5 elements that I call the 5 M's of talent.
And the first one is mindset, which you just touched on, and we'll come back to that. List out the other 5 for me. I have them here in front of me, but I'm curious how you decided on these. But well, they all start with M, and that's convenient. But why these 5? List them out for me, and why these 5?
So the 5 M's are mindset, myelin, mastery, motivation, and mentorship. And these were all the big categories of the things that were universal among people who are talented. And I really found that beyond those 5 M's, yes, other things might matter, but they weren't necessarily universal. That it's all about people's access and their opportunities and the resources that they get that helps them to develop their mindset, myelin, mastery, motivation, and mentorship.
It's interesting. There's lots of schools of thought on this, where some people think, hey, there's the Tiger Woods, the pro athletes of the world. It's inherent, just lucky, born with it. But yet at the same time, I think a lot of people would recognize, and I'm sure athletes or musicians, scientists, people who are exceptional in their field would say, yeah, it might have been there, but boy, the work I had to put in to really bring that to mastery really required more than just being lucky, being born with it. Yes. So I think you're on to something pretty powerful here, because it suggests that, well, anyone can, right? I mean, with enough effort, is that true? With enough effort and motivation, anyone can?
Yeah, I think that the challenge that I have with my framework is that I'm trying to simplify something complex that's sophisticated. And I think that there's a range in which it can become so complicated that it's not helpful, and a level to which it can become so simplistic that it's not true. And so I really do think that all five M's really matter from that standpoint. That so if you were to ask me, like you kind of just did,
Mhm.
can anyone be anything with hard work? I would say, well, no. That as we'll talk about later, hard work is vital to mastery. But what about the access and opportunities and resources? What about the teachers? What about the psychological messages that are being sent? At what age did the person start? That really matters, even though it's still environmental, it's still nurture. Whether somebody starts playing the piano at 3 years old or 33 years old makes a profound difference in perhaps how wonderful they can become at a skill.
I think that's interesting. Let's talk about age just for a second. We're dealing with students for the most part, although our audience is also adults, obviously the parents and teachers. So talk about the students for a second. So you're saying it's important to get started early. If there's this potential talent, then we need to be encouraging kids at a very young age to find that talent. It sounds like that's as important as anything, is just getting them to find what talent it is they might have.
It really is, Richard, and I don't think that means that we need to hyper specialize with the ways that we sometimes are tempted to do with our students and our children. But I do think it means that we need to build a foundation of skills that start at an extremely young age. So I know that your viewership knows all about neurons in the brain. They're one of our brain cells, that we have about 86 billion of them. But I was surprised to learn, Richard, that only about half of our brain is made up of neurons. The
Mhm.
other half is made up of what we call glial cells. And glial cells have a really interesting job. When you learn something, when any of us learn something, it's because neurons are connecting to one another. And these glial cells, what they do is they take those connections and they start to build an insulation around them. So the more that we think, the more that we feel, the more that we do, the more that we practice a particular skill, the more insulation is built around our brain connections, our brain signals by these special cells. That white fatty substance, that insulation, is called myelin.
Hmm.
And I found it so important because myelin is what makes our brain signals faster, stronger, and better. And so when we talk about somebody being talented, what we're really saying from a neurological standpoint is that they have specific brain signals that are extremely well myelinated, that allows those signals to travel literally up to 100 times or more faster than unmyelinated brain signals. Another thing that I found so fascinating was that humans are not born with myelin. We're born with very little of it. We're actually the only species that goes through the vast majority of our brain development after birth. For most species, when they are born, they're able to do things that human babies cannot do because they've already accumulated some of this myelin. We, on the other hand, can't do anything when we start out as babies, but we quickly evolve, and our brains are able to adapt to almost any skill set. So when it comes to age, I've found that ages 2 to 7, our brain connections, what we call our synapses, actually double just in that age range. And then they eventually go back to normal. And then all of a sudden, around puberty at age 12, our brain connections, our synapses double once again in different parts of the brain. And so we have these, what we call critical periods of brain development.
Mhm.
And what I have found is that what we practice and what we're learning during those critical periods can really set us apart.
Wow, interesting, fascinating stuff. That's a conversation in the cafe in and of itself.
Yeah.
It really is. It's fascinating. You're right. We're very big into neuroscience and how the brain functions as it relates to human development. So let's fast forward, sticking with age for a second. And as you can tell, I define myself age wise by my gray hair. That's okay though. I don't have a problem with that. Are So what does someone older do? Someone like me, say a teacher, a parent, someone who's, well into their midlife and beyond. How do they manufacture more myelin? Is it possible, or is there some point where you just kind of run out of time to change?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the two options that you gave me, there's an element of truth in both of them.
Mhm.
That age does matter. That we tend to accumulate and peak at kind of our net myelination at around age 50.
Mhm.
But what that really means is that after about the age 50, we lose what we don't use, and so it's really important to know that the brain can always change. The brain can always learn new things. You can always learn new skills. The older you get, particularly once you've completed your 20s and major brain development has completed for the most part, what you learn after that is going to take a little bit more effort, a little bit more persistence. And after the age of 50, it's quite possible that skills that you gained will really start to be lost at a greater rate unless you practice those. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s learning new skills or continuing to perform at amazing levels. It just becomes an uphill battle at that point.
It also, to me, says that if experience matters, if over time the more myelin you develop and the more neurons that you connect, I forget the exact phrase, but it's neurons that connect together stay together, or some phrase along those lines, meaning the more you connect them, and it may seem obvious, but the more you connect them, the richer your brain ability is. You just have more stuff going on, so therefore lots of experiences, lots of practice. Therefore, as you age, that ought to be an advantage, at least to some extent. You've just seen and heard and smelled and tasted all of these things, had the failures, had the successes, to be able to knit all those neurons together to just make them stronger as you grow older.
Yes.
I'm hopeful about that.
Yes, it is a hopeful message. It is.
So that then leads to say now the third M in mastery. So I'm guessing that as a segue, the longer you practice something, the better you would get at it in terms of improving mastery.
Yes, mastery is both the quantity and the quality of practice, Richard, that's required to develop talent. So in terms of quantity, there is a general pattern that it takes thousands of hours of practice. Some people have found a pattern in research that call it the 10-year rule. Malcolm Gladwell, in a famous book, Outliers, years ago, popularized the 10,000 hour rule. These are estimates. It's important to know. There's nothing magical, or, we can't say that at 9,000 hours, you're not an expert, but at 10,000 hours, you are. It might take some longer or shorter, but the key is that nobody reaches expertise without thousands of hours of practice. And I mean that literally, Richard. We've never found a single person that we admire for their talent that did not spend thousands of hours trying to master it. We can easily diminish the quantity side, but we can also easily overlook the quality side. That I think we all can name people who have been in roles or been in jobs that didn't necessarily seem to get better at it over time. And so unless that time is spent in what some researchers have called deliberate practice, I like to call it difficult practice, because I can tell my kids, if it's not difficult, it doesn't count. It has to be the kind of practice that's stretching you, that's challenging you, that if you're doing that kind of difficult practice over an extended period of time with consistency, where you're not just, practicing way too many hours one week and then not enough hours the next, but you're really showing some consistency over the years, that talent will just continue to increase and accumulate to an extent where all of a sudden it just feels like, oh my goodness, how did I become so good? Because it's such a slow incremental process along the way.
Yeah, well said. And that leads beautifully to the fourth M in motivation, because I think what you're describing says to me that you might have all the talent and you may even get pretty good at it, but if you aren't motivated, it isn't going to matter a whole lot. You just won't put in the time that's necessary to make it happen. Why is motivation so hard? I mean, maybe I'm making an assumption here, but I've read and my own experience has been that motivation's pretty tough. Why is that?
Motivation, all five of these M's, you can really separate the most talented people that we admire from others because of these five M's. But I think you're right, Richard. That motivation piece really seems to be something that separates those who reach levels of expertise that we admire from maybe the average person in the same craft. Um, and motivation, I think, simply defined is just the continual desire to improve. But what's ironic is that the worse I am at something, the easier it is to improve. And so I think we all go through this early phase where we love seeing our progress at such an amazing rate. Eventually, I think good becomes the enemy of great, Richard, where because we become adequate or good or we're satisfied at our skill level, we become less and less motivated to continually improve, especially when the improvements become smaller and the effort to make those improvements becomes so much larger. And so those who really are able to become amazingly talented continue to do these incredibly amazing amounts of work and effort and training, even though at that point they're getting such little short increases in their talent, maybe that you and I wouldn't even notice.
Right.
And yet it continues to allow them to strive to get better and better. And I think that that's really hard to sustain. You know, you and I have probably heard that the definition that strengths are things that you're good at and weaknesses are things that you're bad at. And an author named Marcus Buckingham has really shifted my thinking on that. And he says strengths aren't things that you're good at; they're the activities that make you feel strong. And weaknesses aren't things that you're bad at; they're the activities that make you feel weak or drained. His point being that because talent is developed, because talent is entirely developed, there's no such thing as innate talent, Richard. Talent is cultivated, talent is developed, talent is learned. And because that's true, if you're bad at something and an activity that makes you feel energized and strong, then that's probably a sign that you should invest your efforts in becoming really good at that craft or that activity. Whereas on the flip side, if you're pretty good at something that makes you feel drained and weak, then the effort that you put forth, you're never going to engage it enough to really become great. So I think part of it is owning up to our own uniquenesses and saying, what are the things that make me feel energized and strong? And let me pursue those so I can become excellent. And the other things I'll manage as, minimal levels, acceptable levels of skill development, but not trying to really become great at those things.
It's interesting. Just a second ago, you were talking about these sort of two trajectories at odds. On one hand, there's these, like you said, these giant leaps of success early on because you're really making, but then the success leaps get really small later as you get better and better and better. So therefore, motivation would naturally drop. And at the same time, you have this this notion of failure coming into play, which I think, on one hand, again, kind of an interesting contradiction. On one hand, the brain really grows out of failure, right?
Yes.
The more it's like, I'm not going to do that anymore. So the brain can really get strong on failure. Yet at the same time, you're failing a couple of times too many and your motivation starts to drop. Yet it's at the exact moment when you actually can get really good at something right at the time when your brain is trying to, I don't want to do this. I don't want to keep failing, right? So you got to flip that.
And this is exactly why mindset is so important, Richard, because if you believe that your abilities, your talent can always grow and increase, then what Carol Dweck has found is that you're more likely to see failures as these temporary setbacks, not detrimental. A failure isn't saying something universal about you. It's just saying that at this particular moment, you're not performing at the level that you'd like. But if you have a fixed mindset, if you think that your abilities, your intelligence, your talent is innate, that it's fixed, that there's not much you can do to change it, then these challenges become really scary things. And when you do fail, you don't care about feedback. You don't care about getting better. You care about protecting yourself, protecting your value and your worth, because essentially all of these things become judgments on universal things about you. And that's a really scary proposition. And so even a three-letter word like the word yet, you're not good at this yet, you can't do this task yet, has this powerful message to say, to push and nudge students to a growth mindset and to say, but I believe that you can get there, you're just not there yet. So we keep our high standards and yet also keep our belief that our students can learn and do anything that they are equipped and have the resources to do.
You've brought up the voice in the head, that voice of judgment, that critic,
inner critic, yes,
saying, you can't do this, which leads me to the fifth M of mentorship. And I'm really glad that you put that on there, because I find that being an educator, I look at myself as a mentor. I feel as though I'm a facilitator of learning and learning myself at the same time. And I feel mentorship is a very important aspect of teaching and learning. And so when you had the mentorship, again, started with M, so that's nice and convenient. But of the five, where would you rank mentorship? Is it at the top? Is it just in the middle? Does it matter? Or how important is it?
It's really difficult for me to rank these five M's. They're not necessarily chronological. I think they all are vitally important. But if you're gonna force my hand, Richard, nobody becomes great without great teachers. Nobody. And the people that we admire most, I think especially in the United States of America, we tend to put the achiever, the performer up on a pedestal. And in our country, I think we really downplay teachers and teaching. And we don't know about these people who've worked so hard in the background to make these students excel. But nobody excels without teachers who do two things that I think are really vital and consistent among all great teachers, is that they get their students to perform. They care much more about doing than anything else. They're almost obsessed with students performing, and then they're obsessed with one other thing, which is feedback, specific feedback. Richard, maybe you've heard of the acronym SMART in relation to goals, that we should have goals that are specific and measurable and achievable and relatable and timely. Well, I think that acronym is better applied to teacher feedback. Mentors give specific and measurable and achievable and relatable and timely feedback to their students. They're constantly saying, here's what I saw you do. Here's how to make it a little better. Perform for me again. Try it again. This is true with things like basketball and the ballet, where we could easily see this. But it's also true for great teachers of history and math. They get their students to perform through case studies, problem-based learning, to get their students to perform, and then follow up immediately with that specific feedback of how to get better.
Great, well said. How does somebody find and identify, find, and build a mentor relationship? It is important. It's fundamental. And of course, when you're a young kid and you're in school, you're sort of handed one because they come in the form of a teacher. But as you grow older, it becomes a harder thing to do. And I know even in my case, I'm constantly looking for mentor for myself, and I have one or two. And at the same time, I've been asked a few times. I'm curious about that process, because it is important, but how do you do it?
Well, I think there are a couple things that you look for. One, and this might sound counterintuitive, but I don't think you should judge a teacher based upon how good they are at a craft. That might seem surprising, but I think a much better way to judge a teacher is to judge how good one of their students is at the craft that they're teaching.
Hmm.
So it doesn't matter to me whether somebody is the best piano player in the world. If they're creating students who are the best piano players in the world, then I promise you that is an amazing teacher. So one thing I would look for is, who are the other people getting mentored by this person, and are they excelling at levels that I admire?
Right.
The second thing is that I think that teachers can get jaded, and I don't think that they would maybe say that openly, but mentors, after they try to mentor others, to mentor students, and they get rejected or students don't take their feedback seriously, it gets old, Richard, after a while. It gets tiresome. I think one of the most powerful things that students or others who are looking for mentors can do is to approach a potential mentor and say, I want you to know something. If you give me advice, if you give me feedback, I promise you, I will do it. I will apply it. And if you say that, that is so rare among students that I cannot imagine a mentor not jumping on board and saying, okay, well, I'm going to hold you to that and see if you really mean it. But if you're actually willing to put into practice the things that I tell you, then I think you've found a mentor. I mean, they eat that up. That's what they're about. That's why they're mentors.
Yeah.
But they need to know that you're one of the very rare students who would really take their feedback seriously to excel.
Sure. And that cycles back to some of the things we talked about earlier about motivation,
Yes.
mindset, attitude. Those sorts of things start to emerge, right? Those
Right.
elements start to come out and become obvious. The other thing that I'm taking note of when you mentioned this about mentoring, teaching, coaching, it's reminding me that sometimes I'll watch a sport, for example, and I'm always curious that I'll see a coach who may have some experience in the game, perhaps played, but a lot of times not at a very high level necessarily. They got into coaching, and it's because they're a great coach, not really a great player. Now, there's a few exceptions, but I'm watching out there, and I'm like, wait a minute. I look at some of these mentors and / coaches out there, and I'm quite curious. It sounds like that might be what's going on here, is that they know how to bring the best out of somebody rather than just, I'm good at it.
I think you are absolutely onto something. A couple things I want to say about that, Richard. One is I challenge you to find an amazing coach, a legendary coach that was an amazing player. It is extremely, extremely rare. The second thing I would say about that is that teaching in and of itself is a talent that takes thousands of hours to develop. And I've found that some teachers, some legendary teachers, become so great because they had poor teachers. And by the time they realized it, it was kind of too late for them, right? If you're 20 years old and you realize that you've been taught basketball the wrong way, you're not going to become an NBA player. You're going to lose out to all the people who were taught the right way starting from age 5. So I really think that it's important that we recognize that teachers kind of have an axe to grind. They're trying to give to the world what they themselves often did not receive.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. I love it. And speaking of loving it, the 5 M's, it's brand new concept. I mean, I understand the individual words, but when you put them together, this is up there with, this is what you're doing here, and the way you're articulating it is right up there with some of the leading best, not self-help, but getting you on a path to success. The Coveys of the world. You're on to something here, I think, quite fascinating. And I'm so glad that you shared it with me. Are you in the process of writing a book? Is that where you're headed?
I am writing a book. One of the things that I felt compelled to do as I started to put this framework together. Well, first, honestly, I tried some of these things out with my children. And when I found that they worked to an amazing degree, that we've gotten talent all wrong, that I was really propelled to start to teach this to some college students. I created a class on it. That went extremely well. And that really compelled me to share this more broadly. So I am working on a book. one of the things I wanted to know is, what about the exceptions, Richard? What about Mozart? What about Einstein? What about Michael Jordan? These people who were born so talented. How would I handle that in my book? And so I ended up studying those three individuals, Mozart, Einstein, and Jordan, to see whether they were exceptions to this framework. And I was just shocked to see that they are models of this framework, that none of them would have been described as innately gifted by their peers at young ages, that they consistently developed. They had great teachers, they had great access to opportunities and resources, but they developed their talent over time. And so I'm actually using Wolfgang Mozart and Albert Einstein and Michael Jordan as examples throughout my book to show how mindset, myelin, mastery, motivation, and mentorship can be applied in the reader's own lives and how they were applied by these three greats.
Wow, fantastic. I can't wait for the book. Any plans for timing? Not to put any pressure on you, but we'd love to see the book. What are you thinking in terms of timing?
I hope to finish a draft by the end of this calendar year, and then I'll start seeking out an agent and a publisher in 2021.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully we can distribute this wide and far, and perhaps others who see it and read it and listen will be as motivated as I am, and perhaps that we can help you in some way. I'd love to do that. By the way, you can see Carl Sagan on one side and Einstein on the other.
I did notice that.
And I put those posters out when I'm doing programming, not only the Smarter World Cafe, but when I do classes with kids. And the idea is they were all kids once too.
Yes.
And it takes the 5 M's that you're talking about to bring their talents forward. And there were people involved, there was motivation, the skills and practice, and then maybe most importantly, that mindset, that ability to say, I believe in this and I'm going to go do it.
Yeah, if I can share a quick anecdote, Einstein was so slow to develop verbally that his parents actually took him to a doctor. And his nanny used a phrase in German that translates to almost backwards as like a nickname for Einstein. And those are just a couple of examples to say no one was bragging about Einstein's intelligence. He ended up becoming the face of intelligence because of these 5 M's.
Fascinating. Great story. And I'm sure the three you said, Mozart, Einstein, and Jordan, are part of the book that you have coming out. And I'm looking forward to it. Dr. Sriram, I think I got it all right.
Yes.
And you know what? Thank you so much for coming on. It was very insightful. I enjoyed it very much. And I hope our paths cross again. Let's do a follow-up when the book comes out.
It was an absolute pleasure, Richard. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.